The day Frank Lucas said "I don't pay you" wasn't loud, violent, or dramatic in the way movies usually show power shifts. There were no guns on the table, no shouting, no blood spilled. That's what made it terrifying. It happened in a quiet restaurant, under soft lights, with plates of food untouched, and men who had ordered murders with a nod suddenly realizing they were sitting across from someone who wasn't afraid of them. For decades before that moment, Harlem operated under an unspoken rule. No matter who ran the streets, no matter which black gangster controlled the corners, the Italian Mafia always got paid. It was called a tax, but everyone knew what it really was. 20% of everything flowed upward to men who never set foot in Harlem but claimed ownership over it anyway. Bumpy Johnson had accepted that reality because he understood the balance of power at the time. Frank Lucas understood something else. The balance had changed, and nobody had noticed yet. When Frank sat down across from the Mafia boss, he wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't posturing. His calm was deliberate. Calm unsettles people who are used to fear. The boss studied him, expecting hesitation, maybe compromise, maybe an apology dressed as confidence. Instead, Frank spoke plainly. Harlem was his now. The old arrangement was over. There would be no percentages, no envelopes, no silent payments slid across tables. Not today, not ever. The room went still. This wasn't just disrespect. This was rebellion. Men had died for saying less. The Mafia boss didn't respond right away because he had to recalibrate. Violence was an option, but violence was also a risk. Killing Frank wouldn't magically solve the problem Frank represented. It might make it worse. Harlem wasn't Sicily. Harlem was volatile, emotional, watching. And Frank knew that. What made Frank dangerous wasn't arrogance, it was preparation. By the time he said "I don't pay you," he had already insulated himself. He had loyalty on the streets, not bought with fear, but earned through consistency and fairness. He paid his people on time. He didn't cheat them. He didn't humiliate them. He understood that power isn't about domination, it's about dependency. People depended on Frank. That made him harder to remove than any flashy gangster before him. The Mafia boss pressed him, asking how he thought he could survive without their protection. Frank didn't flinch. He explained calmly that protection only matters if the people you're protecting accept you. Harlem wouldn't. Any attempt to force control would spark riots, heat, and attention from law enforcement. Frank wasn't threatening. He was explaining reality. That was the moment the boss realized this wasn't a kid playing gangster. This was a strategist who had already run the numbers. Frank understood something the Mafia had forgotten. Systems evolve. What worked for 50 years doesn't work forever. The Italians were still thinking in terms of old hierarchies, old fear structures, old pipelines. Frank had already moved past them. His supply chain didn't need their ports. His money didn't move through their banks. His influence didn't rely on their approval. When he said "I don't pay you," he wasn't rejecting authority, he was declaring independence. The boss tried a different angle: respect, tradition, history. Frank listened politely and then dismantled it with a single truth. Respect isn't inherited, it's demonstrated. And that day, Frank had already demonstrated it, not with violence, but with confidence backed by infrastructure. He wasn't asking permission because he didn't need it. What followed wasn't immediate war. It was something more unsettling for the Mafia: hesitation. They agreed to watch him, to wait, to see if he would collapse under the weight of his own boldness. They assumed he would make mistakes, get sloppy, draw attention. They underestimated how patient Frank was. While they waited, he expanded quietly. While they doubted, he consolidated. By the time they realized he wasn't bluffing, he was already untouchable. That single sentence, "I don't pay you," echoed far beyond that room. It told every gangster listening that the rules could be challenged if you were smart enough. It told the Mafia that fear wasn't universal anymore. And it told Frank himself something even more important, that he had crossed a line you could never uncross. Once you look power in the eye and refuse to bow, there's no going back to being invisible. Frank Lucas didn't defeat the Mafia that day with force. He defeated them by removing their leverage. He didn't need their approval, their supply, or their protection. And when a system loses leverage, it loses control. That's why that quiet conversation mattered more than 1,000 shootouts. It marked the moment Harlem stopped paying tribute and started answering to one man who understood that the most powerful word you can say to an empire is no. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface, and that was the most dangerous part. The streets didn't erupt. No bodies turned up. No public retaliation followed. To anyone watching casually, it looked like the Mafia had absorbed the insult and moved on. But behind closed doors, Frank Lucas became the center of every conversation. Not because he was violent, but because he was unpredictable in a way they weren't used to. He wasn't breaking rules loudly. He was stepping outside of them completely. The Mafia began probing him the only way they knew how, indirectly. They leaned on smaller dealers, tested supply lines, spread quiet rumors, waited for cracks. What they found instead was discipline. Frank's people didn't panic. They didn't defect. They didn't talk. Everyone in his organization knew their role, their pay, and their limits. There were no partners arguing over percentages, no lieutenants building their own empires on the side. Frank had structured his operation like a business, not a gang, and that made it resilient in ways the old crime families weren't prepared for. What truly unsettled the Mafia was how little attention Frank attracted. He didn't move like a king. He dressed plainly. He drove modest cars. He avoided the spotlight. The Italians were used to power announcing itself. Frank hid his. Law enforcement kept watching the wrong people, the loud ones, the flashy ones, the violent ones. Frank existed in the background, letting others take the heat while he pulled the strings. Every day he stayed free was proof that his defiance wasn't luck, it was design. Inside the Mafia, frustration grew. Killing Frank would be easy. Surviving the consequences wouldn't. Harlem was not just territory, it was a community with memory. Frank was seen as one of their own, someone who respected the neighborhood and didn't exploit it openly. Any move against him risked unrest, exposure, and federal attention. The Mafia had built its power on invisibility too, and Frank was forcing them into a dilemma where every option carried risk. Meanwhile, Frank treated the Mafia exactly the same as before, politely, calmly, without submission. That was the final insult. He didn't fear them, but he didn't antagonize them either. He simply operated as if their authority no longer applied. Over time, that posture became reality. Deals adjusted, conversations shifted. People stopped asking who Frank answered to. The answer became obvious. He answered to no one. The most ironic part was that Frank's refusal to pay didn't weaken him. It strengthened him. The money he would have lost in tribute went back into his operation, his people, and his infrastructure. His prices dropped. His product improved. His reach expanded. The Mafia watched a man they could have crushed early become too large to touch, all because they hesitated at the moment he said no. That hesitation haunted them. It wasn't just about Frank Lucas anymore. It was about what he represented. If one man could stand up calmly, intelligently, and survive, others might try the same. The fear wasn't that Frank would destroy them. The fear was that he had exposed a truth they had relied on never being questioned, that their power only existed as long as people believed it was absolute. Frank Lucas didn't just refuse to pay the Mafia, he forced them to confront the limits of their dominance. And once those limits were visible, the myth was broken forever. As time passed, the Mafia began to realize that Frank Lucas wasn't just holding his ground, he was redefining the battlefield. Power no longer came from how many men you could intimidate or how your name traveled through the streets. It came from control over systems, logistics, and silence. Frank had mastered all three. While the Mafia argued over respect and hierarchy, Frank focused on efficiency. While they relied on tradition, he relied on innovation. What made this especially humiliating for them was that Frank didn't need to defeat them publicly. He let results speak. His product was better, his prices were lower, his distribution was cleaner. Street dealers naturally gravitated toward him because working with Frank meant stability instead of chaos. There were no surprise shakeups, no emotional decisions, no unnecessary violence. In a world fueled by volatility, Frank offered predictability, and predictability is addictive. Behind the scenes, the Mafia tried to understand how he was doing it. They followed money trails that led nowhere. They monitored ports that never paid off. They leaned on contacts in Europe and came up empty. Every traditional method of control failed, because Frank wasn't playing the traditional game. His supply chain existed outside their mental map, and that was more threatening than any army. Frank understood something critical about power structures. Once people see that the old authority can be ignored without immediate punishment, obedience collapses. He didn't encourage rebellion openly. He simply demonstrated independence. Others watched closely. Some admired it, some feared it, but everyone noticed it, and the Mafia felt the shift before they could name it. At the same time, Frank remained disciplined enough to know when not to push. He didn't expand into Italian territory. He didn't provoke unnecessary conflict. He wasn't trying to humiliate them. He was trying to make himself irrelevant to them. That restraint confused his enemies as much as his defiance. They couldn't label him reckless. They couldn't justify moving against him. He existed in a gray space where action against him would expose more risk than reward.
The quiet truth was that the Mafia had already lost leverage the moment Frank said, "I don't pay you." Everything after that was damage control.
Their power depended on fear being automatic. Frank forced them to calculate, and once power has to calculate, it's no longer absolute. Frank Lucas didn't overthrow the Mafia. He made them unnecessary in Harlem, and that was the most devastating outcome imaginable. What followed was a slow, almost invisible transition, one that most people on the outside never noticed. Harlem didn't change overnight. The corners were still there, the dealers were still there, the money still moved. But the center of gravity shifted. Decisions were no longer filtered through fear of the Mafia. They were filtered through Frank Lucas. That shift didn't come from force. It came from trust, from consistency, and from the simple fact that Frank delivered what he promised. The Mafia watched this transformation with growing unease. Their authority had always relied on being unavoidable. If you sold, you paid. If you didn't, you disappeared. Frank disrupted that equation by proving a third option existed. You could operate independently, quietly, and intelligently, and survive. Once that possibility became real, fear lost its grip, not completely, but enough to weaken the old structure. Frank never celebrated this shift publicly. He didn't give speeches, he didn't claim victory. He continued to behave as if nothing extraordinary happened. That restraint was strategic. Victory invites attention, and attention invites scrutiny. Frank preferred to let others underestimate him. Underestimation had been his greatest weapon from the beginning. Inside his own organization, Frank reinforced discipline constantly. He reminded his people that success wasn't permanent, and that arrogance was the fastest way to die or go to prison. He paid well, but he demanded loyalty. He allowed no freelancing, no side deals, no unnecessary exposure. Everyone understood that the moment they became visible, they became vulnerable. That culture of restraint kept his operation stable, while others collapsed under their own excess. The Mafia eventually adjusted, not because they accepted Frank's authority, but because reality forced them to. They redirected their focus elsewhere, to territories where their influence still worked the way it always had. Harlem became an exception, an uncomfortable reminder that their model had limits. They didn't forget Fran K. Lucas. They simply learned to live around him. Frank's refusal to pay wasn't just a financial decision, it was philosophical. It rejected the idea that power must be inherited or enforced through violence. It suggested that power could be built through understanding systems better than the people who created them. That idea was more dangerous than any gun. And in the end, that same philosophy carried the seeds of his downfall. Because while Frank understood how to outthink the Mafia, he underestimated how visible success eventually becomes. The system he exploited quietly would one day notice him too. But for that moment in time, for those critical years, Frank Lucas stood alone as a man who looked at an empire built on fear and calmly said no, and lived to prove that no could be enough. For a while it felt like Frank had solved the impossible equation. He had neutralized the Mafia without provoking a war, built an empire without drawing headlines, and rewritten the rules without ever announcing that he'd done so. But power, even quiet power, creates ripples. and those ripples eventually reach places you can't control. The same invisibility that protected Frank from the Mafia began to attract a different kind of attention, the kind that doesn't negotiate and doesn't care about respect. Law enforcement had been watching Harlem for years, but like the Mafia, they were trained to look for noise. Shootings, flashy cars, public feuds, reckless spending. Frank gave them no. F that. He blended into the background so well that even when his name surfaced, it never stuck. He didn't fit the profile they were used to. A man making that much money should have been loud. He should have been sloppy. He should have been visible. Frank wasn't. What finally made him visible wasn't a mistake in strategy, but a moment of humanity. After years of discipline, of denying himself the symbols of success, he allowed himself to be seen. Not in Harlem, not on the streets, but in a place where wealth had a spotlight. That single moment cracked the illusion of invisibility he had worked so hard to maintain. Once the idea formed that Frank Lucas might be the man behind the quiet empire, the system shifted its focus. The difference between the Mafia and the government was simple. The Mafia needed leverage. The government needed proof. Frank could neutralize one by removing dependency. He couldn't neutralize the other once the spotlight locked in. Slowly, methodically, investigators began doing what the Mafia never could. They followed patterns, not rumors. They looked at logistics, not reputation. They examined money, not fear. Frank understood too late that while he had beaten one system by understanding its blind spots, he was now facing another system designed specifically to close them. The patience that had once protected him became the very thing that allowed a case to be built, brick by brick. No rush, no noise, just time. And in a strange twist of irony, the same qualities that made Frank powerful in the underworld made him dangerous to the state. He knew too much. He had seen too much. When the walls finally closed in, Frank faced a choice similar to the one he had forced on others years earlier. Protect the structure, or protect himself. The man who once looked a Mafia boss in the eye and said, "I don't pay you," was now staring at a system that didn't ask for tribute, didn't negotiate respect, and didn't care about legends. It only cared about outcomes. And Frank Lucas, master of quiet power, realized that even the most invisible man is still visible to time. When the pressure finally became impossible to ignore, Frank understood something he had avoided thinking about for years. Power has an expiration date. Not because it weakens, but because it accumulates weight. Every decision, every move, every quiet victory adds pressure, and eventually something gives. Frank had beaten the Mafia by refusing to play their game, but now he was trapped in a different one, where silence could no longer protect him. As investigators closed in, Frank saw the same patterns he once exploited. He recognized the patience, the coordination, the way pieces were moved slowly so the target never felt the full shape of the trap. It was familiar, almost comforting. For the first time, he wasn't the smartest man in the room, and that realization carried its own kind of fear. When the arrest came, it wasn't dramatic. No shootout, no chase, just a knock, badges, and the quiet finality of handcuffs. The empire that had taken years to build didn't collapse in a single moment, but it no longer belonged to him. Sitting alone, stripped of movement and influence, Frank was forced to confront the cost of the sentence he had once spoken so confidently. Saying, "I don't pay you," had made him powerful, but it had also made him visible in ways he could never fully undo. Yet even then, Frank didn't panic. He adjusted, just as he had done his entire life. He understood leverage, and he understood timing. The same way he had negotiated with the Mafia, he now negotiated with the system that had finally caught him. He didn't beg, he didn't posture. He offered value, information, truth, names, networks, things that mattered more than loyalty at that stage of the game. To some, this made him a traitor. To Frank, it was consistency. Survival had always been the objective. Loyalty, in his mind, was never blind. It was transactional, just like power. The rules hadn't changed, only the players had. In the end, Frank Lucas didn't walk away victorious, but he didn't walk away broken either. He had stared down the most powerful criminal organization in America and lived. He had rewritten the balance of power in Harlem without firing a war. And even when the system finally closed in, it did so because he had proven something dangerous was possible. That's what made his story endure. Not the money, not the drugs, not the violence, but the moment a man looked at an empire built on fear and tradition and calmly said no, and forced the world to adapt around him. Even after the power faded, that moment remained, echoing as proof that systems only rule as long as no one dares to challenge them intelligently. After everything was stripped away, what remained was clarity. Sitting in a cell with time stretching endlessly in front of him, Frank finally had space to think about the full arc of his life. Not as a legend or a symbol, but as a man who had made a series of calculated decisions and lived with the consequences of every one. Power had given him control, but it had also isolated him. The silence he once used as a weapon now surrounded him completely, and for the first time, he couldn't direct it. Frank realized that the most dangerous thing he had ever done wasn't smuggling drugs, defying the Mafia, or outsmarting law enforcement. It was believing that intelligence alone could outpace time. Systems adapt, people adapt. No advantage stays hidden forever. He had delayed the inevitable longer than anyone expected, but inevitability still arrived, not violently, not emotionally, just steadily. And yet, there was no regret in the way most people imagine it. Frank didn't wish he had paid the Mafia. He didn't wish he had stayed small. He didn't wish he had never spoken that sentence. In his mind, refusing to pay was the moment he became himself. Before that, he was operating inside someone else's shadow. After that, every success and every failure belonged entirely to him. When people later asked what his biggest mistake was, they expected a confession about greed or ego. Instead, Frank spoke about visibility, about how the world punishes those who forget when to disappear. He had beaten fear with logic, but he had underestimated how seductive recognition could be. The moment he allowed the world to see him, the balance shifted. Still, history didn't remember him as a footnote. It remembered him as an anomaly. A man who exposed the limits of inherited power. A man who showed that dominance doesn't always come from violence, but from understanding how systems function and where they fail. His quiet defiance forced institutions far larger than him to adjust their assumptions. In the end, Frank Lucas didn't leave behind a criminal empire. He left behind a lesson. That fear is only effective until someone stops believing in it. That tradition only rules until someone questions it, and that sometimes the most dangerous sentence ever spoken isn't a threat, but a refusal. "I don't pay you." Those 4 words didn't just change Frank Lucas's life. They changed the way power was understood in Harlem forever. And that is where the story ultimately settles, not on the money, not on the violence, and not even on the downfall, but on the meaning of that refusal. Frank Lucas's life becomes less about crime and more about how power actually works when stripped of mythology. He showed that fear is a currency, and like any currency, it loses value the moment people stop accepting it. The Mafia ruled Harlem for decades, not because they were everywhere, but because everyone believed they were unavoidable. Frank shattered that belief without raising his voice, without firing a shot, without announcing a revolution. He simply opted out, and in doing so, forced an entire system to confront its own limits. His rise and fall prove that intelligence can bend power but never fully escape consequence, that silence can protect you longer than violence ever will, but not forever, and that the most dangerous moves are often the ones that look calm on the surface. Frank Lucas didn't win in the traditional sense, and he didn't lose in the way his enemies expected either. He carved out a moment in history where one man demonstrated that systems only feel permanent until someone understands them well enough to say no. Long after the money vanished and the empire dissolved, that lesson remained, echoing quietly, reminding anyone willing to listen that real power doesn't always come from foe, RCE, but from the courage to refuse the rules everyone else is too afraid to question.